Lee, do you want to just start up, introduce yourself, talk about like what you're working on, what your thoughts are, and then after that, maybe Donald can do that too.
Okay. So first, it's nice to be here. Nice to meet Don for the first time. My name is Lee Cronin. I'm the Regius Professor of Chemistry at the University of Glasgow. I'm also the CEO of a company called Chemify. I'm a chemist by training, some training. I don't know what that is necessarily, but I guess, like making molecules and understanding molecules. I've been fascinated with what life is and how to understand life from the most fundamental principles, going from, say, the laws of the universe, if you like, to what we see in culture, right, and evolution. And I would just make a couple of comments because I could talk for ages. As a chemist, I do lots of experiments, and I would say I'm a theoretician that develops theory by doing experiments, because I just don't by kind of interacting with reality and working backwards. And that allows me, by doing experiments, to think about theory and refine the theory. A couple of examples. I'm trying to make computers, that is, robots I can code with a programming language to make molecules on demand, big drugs or whatever. But make a kind of physical brain to understand how networks of materials with information transfer may be evolved into conscious entities. And the other thing is really to kind of work out how what is missing in physics that stops physics predicting the observer that in fact describes physics. And this requires a huge number of layers in going into abstractions and how abstractions work in the framework of evolution, which I'm sure we'll have lots of discussions on. But I'll stop there. I think that's enough intro.
Very good. I'm Don Hoffman. I'm a professor emeritus now of cognitive sciences at the University of California at Irvine. And two main strands of my work, I think, that are pertinent here. One is the evolution by natural selection, and asking the technical question, what is the probability that natural selection shapes sensory systems to reveal true properties of objective reality, whatever they might be? So that's a clean technical question that we can use evolutionary game theory to address. So that's one area, and the surprising result that my team has gotten, that we'll probably discuss, is that the under some fairly trivial assumptions, the probability is zero that any sensory system has been shaped by evolution to see any truths about objective reality. And then the other thread of the research I'm doing is on consciousness, which we have a common interest there as well, in consciousness. The bottom line on my view that sort of differs from the mainstream is that most of my colleagues are trying to boot up consciousness from complex patterns in physical systems, neurons or AIs or whatever it might be. And my view is that there's not a single specific conscious experience that they've been able to explain yet. Despite decades of effort, there's not a single specific conscious experience that they can explain. And I think the failure is principled. These are brilliant people, and it's not for lack of intelligence, it's because there are principled obstructions to it. And so I'm going after a theory of consciousness where consciousness is taken to be fundamental. And I use an Occam's razor argument in some sense, that the current physicalist theories stipulate physical systems, and they have to stipulate the conscious experiences because they can't explain them. So I just stipulate the conscious experiences, and I don't stipulate the physical systems. And I try to show that we can boot up space-time and physical systems just from a theory of conscious experiences. And so the Occam's razor argument then is that's more parsimonious. So, but anyway, those are good opening statements for what I do.
And what is your views on reality and nature of both of you? I'll let Lee first respond, and then Donald can maybe.
Yeah, so I think that so Don really outlined. I mean, it's actually the points that I think we disagree on them in interesting ways. Right. And I would say that I've always been fascinated by evolution, or let's say, let's go back a bit. I'm fascinated by the fact you have biology and you have sand and you have particles, right? You have the universe, particles, sand, cells. And so I've really been focusing on the sand to cells transition. And what we're beginning to show, I think, in the lab and in theory is actually the complete opposite, that the development of the self allows you to read out the environment, and a sensory system gets built by the environment, by the object becoming a self. Let's call it a cell. And actually, it's a pretty faithful readout of reality, physical reality. Now, I'm a materialist. I just don't understand the material. Now, I'm super open to have this discussion. I'm not coming from some kind of dogmatic point of view. And also, it's pretty sure that Don and I will probably, he'll understand the language, what we mean. So what I want to do is just take 1 minute to point out, to say what I think is interesting. So I think selection is a fundamental, let's call it a force in the universe. And selection, basically, there's stuff in the universe, if there was no selection, you just have a combinatorial explosion of everything. Just boom, right? Everything everywhere. But we don't see that on Earth. There are objects, artifacts, languages, and human beings that ostensibly even can create things. That's super weird. Now, what is that? And then you go back down into biology, and you've got this first cell. How did the first cell appear out of nothing? Now, I'm no creationist. I have no beliefs of any kind. Well, I do have beliefs, but my beliefs are, I hope to falsify them one day, so they won't believe beliefs forever, right? So, I kind of know I have beliefs, but I'm always looking for falsification. And so I think the process of sand clumping together, say take some sand on a beach, it clumps together and the water washes it away, the wind blows it away, so that's dissolved, so that object no longer exists. Say another lump of sand comes in, and this time the shape is such that it is resistant to being weathered, so then it lasts for a bit longer. And say that happened, this clump of sand, the next one is not only resistant to weathering, but somehow can help collect some sand to make a copy of itself. And that process of selection, by interacting with the environment, so you've got the outside and the self, because the self has to sense, if you like, interact, feel the environment, starts to build ways to exist via persistence. And persistence, in fact, is, and this I'll get to the point, is my key kind of, I don't know, it's directly opposite to Don's view, but persistence through selection gives sensory systems that read out the environment, and this is where we get to life. Now, I'll finish by saying I'm not sure that's the only part of the story, but I'm pretty sure what we've seen and the way we investigate the universe, that biology is pretty good at interrogating reality and also coming up with fundamental concepts. So I'm really fascinated for this discussion because we have different views on that, and I don't understand all of Don's views, and what I hope to do today is understand his views, even if I don't fully agree with them, because it's very easy to disagree with someone where actually you just don't understand their fundamental axioms, and you're just like you're being triggered because you don't want to believe. Anyway, that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Very, very good. Well, maybe I'll start by just asking one question about that. I've been thinking about on your assembly theory. And that is that how do you think about that your work in relationship to what physicists are doing in terms of what they call the second law of quantum complexity, and those, so Leonard Susskind and Adam Brown and a number, this has now been out for 5 or 6 years, and they're saying that quantum complexity, there's a second law for quantum complexity, just like we have a second law for entropy. The entropy is always increasing, second law of thermodynamics. And so they argue that quantum complexity, so not classical complexity, but quantum complexity. So you have n qubits, you have 2 to the n states. So it grows exponentially, and it's what they call the circuit complexity. Is the target of the second law of quantum complexity, and the proposal is that quantum complexity always grows. So the circuit complexity, so complexity itself, without any intervention, grows just like entropy without any intervention grows, and it grows until it reaches a saturation, a maximum quantum complexity. And the argument they give is that the amount of complexity that hasn't yet been explored in this search is a resource of the system that can be expended to do directed quantum computation. And so that suggests a very interesting, different take on the evolution of complexity. And I just would love to get your take on how you think about the assembly version of complexity versus the second law of quantum complexity.
Okay, great. Okay, I understand. So I think that the word quantum is misused a lot because people like to kind of, there's no difference between classical and quantum complexity in my book. Particles are still particles. Whatever technique you use to get them, you know, you go probabilistic, you know that. So I think that there is actually, there's a deep relationship between the way the universe wants to basically create states. And we have a number of different ways of doing it. And so I would say that the thing that probably I would like to kind of tell you that I think is new and might be helpful is that Adam and Leonard are working in a universe that is basically almost like a block universe, where time is a coordinate you can just go up and down, and they're trying to reconcile evolution in that universe. And that, I don't recognize that. And what I do, but I do have a great deal of resonance and sympathy for the idea of this kind of growing complexity. Now, what does that actually mean? I think what it means, and again, I'm no physicist, and I'm plenty of physicists out there that are willing to tell me, big disclaimer, this is probably nonsensical, but let me outline 4 important things. Physicists tell me there was an order at the beginning, right? So they've got the Big Bang. Second thing they tell me is that there's a second law. And I don't know, the second law is just a law. I just have to take it on faith, right? Why is there a second law? Just is, don't ask. Then from that, time is emergent and causation is emergent. And when I've looked at this and said, if time is just fundamental, I don't need a second law. I don't need order at the beginning, and I don't need causation, emergent causation is all there. And I wonder if time, the fact that time is fundamental is the reason why they've mistaken the fundamentality of time for this kind of second law of quantum complexity. And I'm really fascinated by that, because actually I like the notion that you've got this branching space of possibilities, because what it does, it says, look, the future is more capable of novelty than the past was. And actually, biology is the perfect evolution, novelty miner. Biology uses selection. Selection creates biology, and biology mines novelty from the universe by looking at this space. And it requires time to be fundamental. And I think, in a way, that there is some kind of deep connection there. The whole qubit argument is kind of hard for me for 2 important reasons. Number one, although the mathematics of quantum information theory is well established in some areas of the community, there are some assumptions about the nature of the universe when one interpretation take of quantum mechanics, whether that works or not. And, you know, we talk about the multiverse and the pilot wave and how do we do things. And for me, that's just super undefined. And so when people start to invoke something that's undefined, but anyway, I think there's a lot there to reply to, but I really like this kind of notion the universe is able to do more complex things in the future than it was in the past, but it requires a physicist to get rid of the canon, the fundamental assumption that time is just a coordinate.
So do you think that time then is a fiction that we're making up, or what is your view of time in this case?
No, I think that time is a reality. In fact, I say that there are 2 types of time, and I confuse people by saying time is fundamental. They're like, you know, I said this to physicists, and they say this is just crazy. Time is just the act of measuring, and I mean, no. Think of space that isn't space. You're like, what was that? So just think of a manifold that has no meaning in space, but it is just time, and that has always existed. And time is more fundamental than space, and space emerges from time. And then if you do it, and I think that Lee Smolin has some similar ideas, and I've been working a little bit with. We're actually working a lot with Sarah Walker on this idea and assembly theory, and also discussing with Paul Davies, who is a cosmologist and understands time pretty well, and trying to challenge him on this. So I think if I was to lay a bet, completely like, I'm so unqualified for this statement, but it feels right because as a chemist, I'm qualified with the second law. Time is fundamental, so this time is happening. So there's this matrix, which is literally, let's call it like almost like quantum complexity that's just evolving and there's no space. And then space emerges from that. So you go from non-locality to locality. And at the same time, in the space, you can measure things in space. That's what we call time. But at the same time, the envelope of possibilities is always growing. And that time is non-negotiable. And that's why there's a second law. Because the second law just said, hey, there's more ways to organize things in the future than there were in the past. Why is that? What is it about the universe that makes it deeply unsymmetrical? So I would say that time is not a fiction. It is the only reality we know, if that makes sense.
Okay. Very interesting. Okay. So, in that case, what do you think about then the work of the physicists like David Gross and Nima Arkani Hamed, who are taking the next step and saying that space and time themselves both are not fundamental, that space-time is not fundamental. They say space-time is doomed. And they're actually finding structures entirely beyond space and time. And they show how space and time arise as projections of these deeper structures. And one thing that argues for these deeper structures is, for example, they find, Nima's found this thing called the amplituhedron, right, that allows him to compute scattering amplitudes for, for example, 2 gluons smashing into each other and 4 gluons spraying out. And when you use the standard quantum field techniques, where you're assuming space and time are fundamental, and you're using Feynman diagrams and virtual particles and computing the scattering amplitudes that way, you get hundreds and hundreds of pages of algebra. But when you let go of space and time, so the reason I'm bringing this up is you're letting go of time as well. When they let go of space and time, then they find these structures that first reveal new symmetries about the scattering events, like something called an infinite Yangian symmetry that you can't see in space-time. And second, the math becomes trivial. It's, well, much easier. Two or three terms that you can compute by hand versus hundreds of pages of algebra that stump like a supercomputer. So what they're finding is if you let go of time altogether, it's not fundamental, and you let go of space, and you let go of space-time, the union, then all of a sudden there's this whole new world beyond space-time that opens up, and it reveals new symmetries that are true of the data, and it makes the computations much easier. So what do you think about those arguments against time?
So I think that there is something interesting in the mathematics that revealed, but I don't think that letting go of space-time is something that makes any sense to me, because I can't falsify it very well. But let me just try to, let's just run with it for a second. So the really interesting thing is the act of them actually having to let go of space-time, they have to do the compute in time. So they're not really letting go of it, are they? What they're doing, they're saying, in my simulation, I'm actually going to remove these guardrails and see what happens. And that what that's probably saying is there is an attractor in those dynamics that doesn't need the confusion of space-time. So I think that there is something that is, maybe there's a deeper symmetry, there's a relationship. I'm no expert here, but I think that they are misunderstanding the result and saying, oh, the mathematics says space-time must go, the mathematics has to be right. And I think that perhaps a misreading of some additional structure. But, I would like to, what would be great is if, rather than just making sense of an object they've found, this would be the thing. if they could use that structure to predict something new about reality before we know it, say, right, we're going to get rid of space-time, and then we're going to come up with this new kind of framework that makes this prediction with this explanation, and then go forward, then I'd have to take that seriously. But I haven't seen any evidence that I'm not familiar with it. But I just think what happens is when you remove coordinates, you get Platonic artifacts, actually. And the mathematics we have, I'm playing with an idea, again, with Sarah and a few others, that mathematics is actually not fundamental in terms of in the universe. It's connected to our lineage and relate. And of course, the axioms in the universe go down, 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 the memory goes down. They're non-negotiable. But there are artifacts you can find in mathematics which are generated by humans uniquely on our lineage, which make this whole kind of idea was maths invented or discovered. And I think maybe the thing you're talking about there is super interesting because it's a reformulation of that question, perhaps. I don't know if that resonates, but it's a super interesting work that you describe. It's just conceptually beyond me. And it will take me some time to kind of, try and figure out if there is a way of falsifying it or making it predictive and explanatory.
Right. So the argument that, for example, David Gross gave in a 2005 article on this, where he said space-time is doomed, was that, as we go to smaller and smaller scales, we try to get better and better microscopes that look at smaller and smaller parts of reality with higher resolution. To do that, we need light or some other kind of radiation with smaller and smaller wavelengths, right? And so that's going to require more and more energy to do that, E equals h nu. And at some point, the mass energy density that you create, putting such a small wavelength that's into space-time, will have such a high mass energy density there that you will actually create a black hole. And so that space-time itself, not just space, but time, ceases to have any operational meaning. And so for the physicists, they say, look, they're not arguing that space-time is doomed because they found these new structures beyond space-time. They're arguing that space-time is doomed because our best theories of space-time right now tell us that concept is pretty shallow. It falls apart at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. Not 10 to the minus 33 trillion centimeters, just 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. It falls apart.
Yeah, but that's still quite small. I get it though. I mean, I think I used to dream when I was a kid of having a laser pointer where I could dial up a, almost like a Rick and Morty like wormhole, right? There is an infinite density that the universe can cope with. Whether that's an artifact or not, I don't know. I mean, I think I'm tempted to go back to my hobby horse, which might then that might then resonate with your hobby horse, but then we'll just hobby horse out. And so I would say that what I'd say is my indication is that space, I'm going to make an outrageous statement. I think that space is actually not that real, but time is. And that really all that exists is our ability to move forward in time. And because we can go locally back, it feels like space exists because there literally is a distance. And then I had this fantasy that, let's just imagine you go back in time, beginning of the universe. So Big Bang, everything's spreading out, spreading out, spreading out. What is space? Space is expanding. So this is volume, interactions. But could it be that space, sure, there is evidence, you can make measurements, and you can see the size of the universe. But what happens when the universe gets so big that particles no longer interact? And it makes no sense to imagine an infinite universe where every particle infinite around it. And I'm wondering if space is merely about local, in the way that people misunderstand time as measurement between effects, is space about just local causal connections? And so when the universe gets so big that there are no more causal connections in the universe, could it be that space ceases to actually be space and it's just back to non-locality again? And so again, there's time. I just don't know, but it's a lovely thought experiment. People are going to say you're just stupid because it's just really flat, and but think about it. It's like, is space just about our local causation? Because we're right now, we can probably move. I could go to California and see you. You could come to Glasgow and see me. We go back and forth, same place, but we're not in the same space because we're on planet Earth rotating through the solar system that's moving through the Milky Way, that's moving through the universe, and we're never going to be back in that same space again. But we can locally go back. So I'm actually fascinated about how long-term interpretation of space. But again, as a very amateur physicist, I think that this will trigger lots of physicists to have arguments that are non-productive. But I kind of understand what you're saying. But I'm wondering really, and this is my question for you, is like and if you had to make a guess, well, how do we explain the second law? Can we abandon the second? Would you buy the idea of abandoning the second law with just making time fundamental, and that time gives rise to evolution? Because I think you like, well, you resonate with how evolution and cognition work, and you, obviously what I guess that you say that evolution kind of fools cognition, and I'm not quite with that. I think that cognition reveals evolution in the right way, but can be fooled. So I'm kind of interested in kind of triggering people about my inelegant, uneducated notions about space-time, because I have this problem with the second law, because I just don't understand the reason for its existence beyond statistics and labeling and putting on an arrow of time. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts on the second law for it not being fundamental, but I'll go into it in a minute. But it requires a bigger picture. I would just say though on your comments on space-time, some of the physicists who are thinking deeply about space-time are trying to boot it up from not from causal connections between particles, but from entanglement. So they're using the notion of entanglement as the bootstrap for building up space-time. And there, the issue that you raised wouldn't be there, because entanglement, you don't need to be close to be entangled. You could be billions of light years apart, and the entanglement is just as strong as if you were 2 inches away. So there's a lot of work being done on trying to boot up space-time from quantum theory via entanglement, which you may want to think about in terms of what you were just saying there before. But in terms of my thoughts on the second law and time, for reasons that we can get into if we have time, I'm agreeing with the physicist that space-time is doomed. I think that it doesn't have any operational meaning beyond the Planck scale, and what we have to do is just recognize that our own theories of space-time very clearly tell us that theoretical framework has limited use. The limit is the Planck scale, and after that, it's no longer useful. And we just have to acknowledge that it had a useful ride for several centuries, and it's over. And it's time for us to let go of that and move on to a deeper and more fundamental structure than space-time. So one hint that I've gotten is from what they're finding beyond space-time right now. One of the deepest structures they found are something called decorated permutations. So these are like permutations, shuffling cards, permutations, but with a slight twist. If you're interested, we can go into the slight technical twist that makes a permutation different from a decorated permutation. But they found, to their surprise, that these decorated permutations, in the case of massless particles, basically capture everything you need to compute the scattering amplitudes for like 2 gluons in, 4 gluons out. It's all in these permutations. It's truly stunning. But the question is, permutations of what? What's going on out there? This is what they're finding are static, like polytopes, or they're finding the amplitude hedron is not a polytope, but it's a geometric structure. They're finding these static structures or static mathematical entities. And so that got me thinking, is there some kind of dynamical entity that we could be positing beyond space-time that would explain, for example, what they're finding, the decorated permutations? And so in a paper we published in January, we showed that there's a canonical mapping from Markov chains to decorated permutations.
Mm-hmm.
So Markovian dynamics, the recurrent communicating classes, turns out, are classified by decorated permutations. So the idea would be then, okay, so the physicists have gone beyond space-time. They're looking for these structures beyond space-time. One of the deepest structures they find is decorated permutations, but they have no dynamics. Well, it turns out as a theorem that a Markovian dynamics has its recurrent communicating classes classified by these decorated permutations. So this suggests a hidden Markov model of space-time, right? So all the particles and objects that we see in space-time are just the observable states, but there's all these hidden states. And what physics is doing now is taking the first step. So what we've been, space-time has just been a representation basically of the quote unquote observable states of the big Markov model, but there are all these hidden states and hidden Markov processes. And they've discovered a classification of them in terms of these decorative permutations, but we can now actually go deeper and get a Markovian dynamics. Now to your question about the second law. Okay, so
before that, can I just quickly ask? Because I mean, I really, this is really interesting to me. I'm a substrate first type of guy, whether it's time and then time and space and then stuff. What I want to push on a little bit is these dynamics that you're observing. You need space and a bit of time to observe them in. They don't exist for me outside of that. They're mathematical entities. And so what I really understand that my total confusion with this, it is total confusion, is like they have to be instantiated somewhere, right? They don't exist nowhere. Now, are you meaning that there is a different type of space below space, or is just we're just able to imagine these things? The thing is, it's very easy in a mathematical universe to make morphisms between objects and show that they're equal, and then basically come up with a new kind of paradigm for it, which I think that's what's happening here. And that's why I was kind of nudging a bit on saying that this architecture has to become predictive and explanatory for something that we actually can see. Otherwise, it becomes like a load of other theories, which is super interesting and elegant and kind of confounding, but it becomes unfalsifiable. And not just unfalsifiable now, but in principle unfalsifiable. And then we get into the edge of, is it then science, right? Is it something else, a philosophical framework? But I mean, I want to know more about that. I'm just really genuine, because I'm wondering, is it another substrate you're imagining? Saying, well, no, I don't mean this space-time, I mean this, something that is lower than the Planck scale, that is instantiated. I'm sorry to cut you off about the second law.
Right. Well, right. So the structures that the physicists are finding, they're not thinking about the structure like the amplitude-hedron and these decorated permutations as sort of curled up dimensions inside of space-time. Like for example, in string theory, you might think of there are these extra dimensions, but they're really sort of curled up inside space-time. They're just so small we can't see them. What the physicists are saying here is no, this is entirely new, a new way of thinking.
But where does it exist? It must exist somewhere.
So.
Is it? I mean, are we then becoming dualists and say there's an entirely new projection of the universe from which space-time is projected in? There's this kind of, when I've listened to you talk about this, and it's super, intriguing. I'm trying to kind of position myself in where am I in the observer in the universe? Am I looking down on the universe? Am I in the universe? Am I saying, oh, there's this thing in which the universe exists, which is projecting reality into it somehow?
Well, I think the physicists. So the structures that they found, it's only 10 years ago that they found the amplitude-hedron. So this is fairly new, right? And I think that I haven't seen them talking about an ontology beyond space-time. They're not saying what the nature of the entities or structures beyond space-time is, but right now it's a mathematical pursuit. They're just saying space-time as a mathematical structure is provably inadequate. Our own theories tell us it's inadequate. It falls apart at Planck scale. So they're just using mathematics to say what deeper framework could we come up with. We'll figure out what the mathematics means later in terms of an ontology. For example, right now they have no dynamics. It's all static structures. So this is the early steps. But the idea is basically we've realized that space-time on its own theories stops at the Planck scale. It's time for us to move to a deeper structure, first just mathematically, but then later on, once we have the mathematics down, we can start to consider what ontologies we might want to have, because any entities beyond space-time is going to be new territory, right? But it's clear that their attitude is not that this is just going to be an extension of our notions of space and time. This is something fundamentally different. It's fundamentally different in the sense that not only do space and time arise, but quantum theory is not fundamental either. Quantum theory itself will arise from these deeper structures that where there's no notion of unitarity, for example. So they don't have an ontology. So but that's, I think, just part of the growing pains. This is only 10 years old. I would forgive them for not having an ontology yet.
I understand, but there's lots of people that have got mathematical structures they're coming up with, like in string theory, and then people proposing new types of geometries and so on. And I would say that, you know, the invention of complex numbers allowed us to basically understand how the universe was able to be built. And let me summarize what you're saying to me so I can get back to you. So you're saying below the Planck scale, something weird is happening, and the current theories are inadequate to explain it. I think I get that. I think I understand why you're saying that, and I don't think I necessarily disagree with that because there's a fundamental limit there.
Right.
Now, that's the Planck scale when you're looking at. Now, when you've got the Planck scale and you're looking at space, then time gets built in because you've got uncertainty there, and you're trying to look at something super, 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 super small. So you're saying, maybe there's a problem with time as well. I just think that they're over parameterizing, and they're saying something is broken. What I'd like them to do is an experiment, and that I think what you're saying. So I think I understand that. Great. What I would like to push on is to say these features are just seem to be geometrical oddities unless we can come up with a tangible consequence that explains something about the universe that we can observe. Otherwise, I have no way of putting it in my scale of science, right? It could be cool. The Planck, the space-time might be doomed, but not in any space-time I'm in because I act at the scale. So it's good for me. And I would like, to kind of, and I think that's where string theory has got trapped, right? And string theory is producing a lot of interesting mathematics. And it sounds like the amplitude hedron and the prospect of having these Markovian processes, these decorated permutations, I think you said, and permutations, sounds super interesting mathematical structures. So what does that mean? I don't know, but I wouldn't abandon space-time just yet. I might abandon space for a bit. But let's go deeper. I think I understand the point of our disagreement. It's not a major disagreement, actually. It's like, you're saying there are limits to what we know in physics, and I think that's true, right, in terms of relativity and quantum mechanics. And I think it's an exciting place to look. So I think I should be less dismissive of these new ideas because we don't know what's happening with the unification of these fundamental big and small things. So that's cool. Yeah, sorry. So second law.
Right. So I would just say on the time thing, the issue is that our current equations, of quantum field theory and general relativity, tell us that time ceases to have any operational meaning at 10 to the minus 43 seconds, roughly. So the attitude here is, quantum field theory and general relativity are the best scientific theories we have right now for space and time. Those are the best. And those theories, whether or not they're true, they're the best theories we have. And those theories tell us that time makes no sense beyond 10 to the minus 43 seconds.
But so the measurement of time.
Any operational use of time.
The measurement of time. But I think that if there is a time manifold, which is pushing the universe out, then it doesn't matter because it's just a time manifold. But of course, there is a minimum resolution. And I think, that makes sense to me as well, because we've got fundamental limits on the radiation that we use in the universe, right? There's only what's lower than what is higher energy than a gamma ray, right? And, what is like you pointed out really elegantly earlier, say if you keep going, you're just going to basically effectively have a singularity, and that is where you're saying this fundamental limit comes from. Get it?
Right. Okay, so we can turn then to the second law question, and what I'm thinking about where that might come from. And now what I'm saying is not about what the physicists are saying. So this, I want to make clear, I'm not going to blame any of those physicists for what I'm about to say, right? This is my own mistake. This is not their mistake. Okay, so what I and my collaborators are looking at is a Markovian dynamics of entities beyond space-time, whatever those entities might be. We can talk about that, what the entities might be later on. But right now, they're just entities beyond space-time. There's a Markovian dynamics. And the reason for entertaining this Markovian dynamics is because decorated permutations classify recurrent communicating classes of Markovian dynamical systems. So the idea is maybe that's what the physicists have found is something that's pointing to a deeper Markovian dynamics. So now it's straightforward to write down a Markovian dynamics in which the entropy of the dynamics does not increase with the step. So I'm now distinguishing between the steps of the Markov chain beyond space-time and any notion of entropic time. So the Markov chain has an entropy defined on it, but you can easily write down Markov chains in which the entropy does not increase. But if you take such a Markov chain and project it via conditional probability to get a new Markov chain, which is sort of a projection of the original chain, it's a theorem, a trivial to prove theorem, that the projected Markov chain will have an arrow of time. The entropy will increase, not because that entropy increasing is an insight into the original chain. It's not. It's entirely an artifact of losing information in the projection. So I would propose that the second law of thermodynamics and our perception of an arrow of time is in no way an insight into anything about the nature of reality. It's entirely at the foundation an artifact of the projection. We're seeing an entropic arrow of time when there is not one in objective reality whatsoever. There's just a step parameter of a Markov chain outside space and time where entropy is not increasing. So that's where I see the second law coming in, and all the laws of physics, by the way, that are functions of time, are artifacts of projection. And no surprise, if you have a big hidden Markov model, and you're only able to see the observable states, and you write down equations for what you can see on the observable states, then you will be missing all of what's going on in the hidden states and all the dynamics behind them. And so no surprise that you're going to see artifacts. The laws that you will see when you only look at the visible states will effectively be artifacts of the loss of information.
So are you saying the second law is an artifact from the loss of information from outside the observable universe?
Exactly right.
Right. So, I mean, I want to deeply disagree with it. I just don't. But I don't. It's not that I disagree with it. I just don't know what to do with it because I'm like outside the universe. So let's go back a step here. So let me try and kind of. So I don't think that's right. Okay. But I have some. But it's kind of a neat. I would have to think about it some more. I mean, I insert these things. So you're saying I'm going to have. I mean, if we're going to have some conservation principles here, and the information is going somewhere, where's it going? Is it recoverable in principle reversibly? So that's kind of one thing you need to think about. If it's just lost, then you're just saying, well, it's magic. What I've got is this thing called the universe. We lose entropy by this information. It's just magic. It just goes from the universe. I would perhaps say, if you don't understand the substrate, well, not don't understand, that's a poor way to put it. If you're not specifying where that substrate is, where that information is going, then it doesn't really say anything. You're just saying, yeah, there's entropy. I think you've got to kind of. I would like to know a bit more about. In principle, is that recoverable?
Well, so what I'm saying is, if you just think about hidden Markov models, right? You can have a Markov dynamical system in which the entropy is not increasing. But when you just look at the observable states of that whole thing, it will look like entropy is increasing on those observable states. Just
right.
And the reason is because of the loss of information. So
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. So I'm just trying to understand. So I think what you're saying is like entropy is really an artifact of the labeler.
Is the artifact of what?
The labeler. Say, I'm going to label these states, right? Yeah, and that's what you're saying. Now, I don't actually disagree with that, but that still doesn't explain why stuff happens, right? And so I think that entropy is. So I think this is boring. We're going to agree too much. I don't pretend to understand what you just told me on any level. But what it sounds like to me is if I collapse it down, it's like this is a labeling problem, and I see entropy as a labeling problem. But still, things happen, and the universe is getting bigger, and there seems to be a beginning of the universe that you can wind back to. And these things seem to happen, and I'm sadly or fortunately for the universe, I get old and die, as do, and I don't tend to bump into myself in the past. So there is some causation. And so what I think that you're saying is that, hey, I think I can view entropy in this way. And actually, that might be deep and right, because it doesn't tell me anything about the mechanism that explains to me why the universe has these features. And I think the problem with your entropic reality here and this hidden Markovian model, say, oh, well, these are the observations, is that it doesn't actually explain why the observations consistent with the second law of C. So in a way, we might both end up agreeing, say, well, maybe there is this fundamental thing called time, and time is going on, and to make sense of time, we make the second law. But one interpretation of the second law is what you're saying. So that's kind of interesting to me. Let me just make one comment very quickly, if I may, about assembly theory. You asked about it earlier. How's it fit? Assembly theory I've been working on as a theory for understanding how selection acts as a force in the universe. I've been doing this in collaboration with a team in ASU led by Sarah Walker. And what we're beginning to realize, assembly theory explains how selection can produce, or how complexity and selection work together, and how we can identify evidence of selection and causation. And how causation is quite fundamental in the development of the universe, from fundamental particles to culture. So we can draw a line from the beginning of the universe to, I don't know, memes on TikTok, right? It's all of that. And what assembly theory seems to say is, hey, the observation of the macro scale of evolution, and also at the genetic scale, and is telling us something very fundamental about particles interacting through chemistry, giving us molecules, giving cells, giving us the emergence of cells and evolution, and these evolution and novelty. And I think that I just wanted to kind of express that, because you asked what was it about. Now, are there any parallels between assembly theory and some of the quantum kind of information, things? I think probably yes, probably no. But the thing is, I don't really want to play the quantum thought experiments yet, because I think you can recover most of what you need by thinking about it classically. But just to cut a long story short, assembly theory just allows you to do the following thing very practically. If I gave you two lumps of matter, like equal number of atoms and atom types, you should be able to look at one lump and the other and analyze it and say, oh, product of evolution, no evolution. And what assembly theory does, it allows you to take an object or collection of objects and recursively deconstruct them to a number of atoms or objects, and then show what is the shortest path to build that object, a number of steps. And critically, how many identical copies of that object you can find. And assembly theory says, hey, if you can find an object which is kind of not very reducible, need lots of steps to be made, and you find just another copy, or then 10 copies and 20 copies, you knew something as crazy is going on. So if I took my iPhone and I put it through ground it up back to sand, pile of sand. But if I had two piles of sand and I had two iPhones, you would instantly look at the two iPhones and go, oh gosh, product of evolution technology. So I just wanted to make that diversion to explain what assembly theory is. I like assembly theory in a way, because assembly theory in a way might actually allow us to explain, and you might like this, and you could also fire a torpedo for it, how the universe almost kind of starts to operate on itself and become cognitive. So you've got this causal chain of events making these objects, and when these objects can act on the chain that made them, they can get more sophisticated. You can make this kind of von Neumann-like machines or replicators, and at some point you have a self. And what is a self? Well, the self is defined by an object that has some autonomy, or it's a bit of a look, but can operate in the environment, kind of exist, persist, maybe even copy itself, and get more complex. And that's what assembly theory gives you. And I'm wondering, and again, I don't think the cognition is at the base. I'd love to, because it sounds to me like, again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, it sounds to me like you're a panpsychist. No. Okay, you're not. So tell me about the difference, because I'm very interested in these views. But it sounds like to me that you view cognition as very fundamental, maybe even more fundamental than I view like photons in the universe. And I'd love to reconcile those views. Anyway, that's me stopped on assembly theory. I hope that was useful.
Right. So I'll talk about that a moment, but on your point about assembly theory and causal connections and so forth. So from this other point of view, where space-time is doomed, okay, that the physicists come up with, there's another way to look at how when we see things that we say this is living and that's not living and what's going on here, if we view space-time as not the fundamental reality, but maybe just a user interface, okay? So it's just the observable states of a much deeper hidden Markov model, okay?
Right.
So all we're seeing is the pixels of the interface when we look in space-time. And just so for right now, I'm on a Zoom with you, or not a Zoom, but a Chrome, on Chrome and whatever this is.
Google Meets.
Yeah, Google Meets, there we go, Google Meets. And so I'm seeing pixels on the screen, and I see some pixels, for example, of the ceiling in your room, and those pixels are pointing me to inanimate objects. I see some pixels of books, but I see pixels of your face, and those are giving me some insight into what you're thinking and feeling and so forth. Now, would I want to say that some of the pixels are conscious and living, and some of the pixels are unconscious? No, I would want to say pixels are pixels. A user interface is just a user interface. And sometimes the user interface symbols give me more insight into what lies beyond, and other times they give me less insight. And so the distinction, so I want to propose that not only is the second law of thermodynamics entirely an artifact of projection, but also the distinction we make between living and non-living itself is not a principal distinction. That distinction itself is entirely an artifact of mistaking the limits of our interface for an insight into the nature of reality. Just like mistaking pixels of your face for being conscious pixels versus the pixels for your ceiling as unconscious. It's the same mistake from this other point of view. So if we think of space-time as just a data structure, it's the data structure that we use for the observable measurements that we can make, and that's all it is. It's nothing more than that. It's not reality, it's our interface. Whatever reality is, it's deeper than that. And we can go to the evolutionary arguments for why evolution would give us only a user interface.
One quick comment there. So do I agree with living and non-living? Yeah, to some degree. I think what I would be very pushy on is that assembly theory allows you to identify objects that are the product of evolutionary dynamics and selection. In fact, at the beginning, it must be just selection. So these pixels have come from things which have looked like they've been selected on at some point. In fact, in a way, assembly theory says that there is no such thing as life or death. It's just all selection. And biology is just super good at being a selection amplifier, evolution amplifier. And the artifact you get, because if I freeze your body for an attosecond, you would be as dead as the pile of sand. But then unfroze, there is this kind of this symphony orchestra. There's a conductor is whatever it is in time is making everything work and information being processed. So I would agree with that. And I think that assembly theory just allows you to identify pixels that have come from material that have been produced by a causally directed graph, if you like. And then if we start to look at this in a kind of, and is that a projection from somewhere else? Well, maybe, but everything is a projection of something. I just don't know how deep it goes, and whether whether bringing in this projection is again useful for learning more about our reality. So that's a good point. So I think we kind of agree on that. The limits when someone says, "Was COVID-19 alive or dead?" It's like, well, it was neither. When COVID is in your cell, it's living because it's evolving. When COVID's outside and you're sneezing it around, it's not living, but it has the ability to affect selection. So therefore, it's very causal.
Right. That makes sense. So, yeah, so I think, we sort of explored that a little bit, which I should turn back to your other question maybe about panpsychism for a moment.
Yeah, please, yeah.
So the reason I'm not a panpsychist is I think that it's not a very helpful perspective, right? So the panpsychist I'm thinking about is one who says, I take the laws of physics and the particles of physics, that's a fundamental nature of reality. So I'm happy with that. And I'm also going to have consciousness as fundamental. So it's like a dualism. And I'll just say that the conscious experiences are the reality behind the laws. You know, Stephen Hawking asked what breathes fire into the laws of physics. Well, it's consciousness is the fire behind the law. And when you do that, consciousness seems to, it's just dualism, which I think is giving up, and it's not really, you're taking the current physics on face value, and you're just putting consciousness. So I don't see it doing any real work. It's not really solving anything for me. So that's why I'm not a panpsychist. I do think that I agree with the physicists that, you know, the high energy physicists like David Gross and Nima, who say that space-time is not fundamental. So I agree with them. That means that the particles inside space-time are not fundamental. And so that's another reason to not be a panpsychist, because the panpsychist is.
I get you. Yeah. So I think I understand. I was being silly. So panpsychists basically say, let's just agree. So I think people watching say, what's the difference? That basically particles that exist in our universe have some degree of consciousness associated with them that can aggregate up. I'm no panpsychist, and what you're saying is no. Actually, we're not talking about that. There's something, because there is you're looking at layers below our reality, below space-time. You're asking what happens there in terms of consciousness and cognition, right?
That's right.
So, are you a materialist?
No. I again, I agree with the physicist that space-time is doomed. So
But what I'm saying is, all right, you're kind of like I think you're a materialist about, and this isn't a pejorative. You're materialist about the material. What I mean is, like, materialists exist in space-time, but they do not believe in a dualist. And I don't think you're a dualist or a materialist. You're something else, right?
I'm a monist, so I'm not a dualist. I'm a monist. But I'm not a physicalist, so I'm not a physicalist monist. I'm not a materialist.
It's good. I'm trying to understand, because I'm giving myself a crash course in philosophy. I mean, I had to basically work out in the last few days. I'm actually, my epistemology, like the word, like, is I'm Popperian, and why I'm kind of arguing with the AI people at the moment is they're all basically Bayesian kind of people, and I love discovery. I think the universe is giving us new novelty and discovery, and I'm trying to work out my own architecture I need to do to mine that out, but I'm just kind of digressing. Okay, great. Let's continue. You're a monist.
Right. And so and one reason for being a monist is that attempts to boot up consciousness from a physicalist framework have, in my book, all failed, right? There's not, as I mentioned at the start, there's not a single specific conscious experience that can be. So that I mean, at some point, I mean, I'm glad that there are brilliant friends of mine and colleagues who are working on that. We should continue to pursue it. But my guess is that's a dead horse, and we'll whip it long enough to find out that it's really dead. So I'm not going to waste my time on doing it, but I'm glad.
Let me make a suggestion. Here's the thing. Imagine and you're invited to my lab, by the way. What we're doing at that point is we're making what's called a Ken brain. And I'm trying to understand, what is it about the architectures of the brain that allow us to process information and integrate it over such a small volume at the right power dissipation, so we don't melt it, so we have this conscious experience, qualia, and so on. And one of the things I think we're going to be able to do in my lab is, I think, I'm going to be careful to not overclaim, I would like to, so the brain is a physical thing. Right now, I think we agree. We walk around in bodies and we talk to each other, and we can agree to some cognitive definition that we are agency and we may be arguably conscious, if that has a definition. So I think I'll argue with that. So what I would like to do is, like, the whole AI debate is kind of bamboozling me at the moment, because it's just like people have discovered test tubes and they think the end of the world is nigh. So parking that to one side, I think it would be great if I could somehow, as a materialist, physically instantiate a consciousness in an object. Now, how do I do that? Well, for me, there's a number of ways of quickly doing it. Well, quickly, not so quick. Go back to the beginning of Earth, wait for the origin of life, wait for the emergence of cells, and then wait for multicellularity, creation of sensors, creation of then more information processing. Hey, presto, fast forward a few 100 million years of brain. Okay, so brain contains of nerves, ion channels, and all this stuff. I was thinking in the lab, why don't I just actually try and construct a physical object, a gel, brain gel, which is not a human brain, it's just chemicals. And what I try and do is I use a load of sensors. I think you'll like this because this fits into how evolution and sensing can fall. I basically take a load of sensors that I use to program my gel as it's undergoing embodied cognition. I think that embodied cognition is the way to intelligence via consciousness. And I'd like to make one in my lab. So let's imagine in 10 years, let's imagine, I don't promise it, that you can come to my lab in 10 years and you'll be able to talk to this lump of stuff. And it will basically not just, I mean, the Turing test, everyone misunderstands the Turing test. David Deutsch is right about it. You're actually able to converse with this lump of stuff as if you're talking to another conscious entity. That would be super interesting. Now, it may not actually damage your view because, you know, I don't think you disagree the brain is where we're conscious, or do you?
Well, so I think that the symbols within space-time that best correlate with what we can measure about consciousness are brain symbols.
Yeah.
The issue of whether brains and neural activity causes consciousness is a separate question, right? There I think that neural activity doesn't cause conscious experiences because I think that space-time itself and its objects are not fundamental. That means neurons are not fundamental. And so since they're not fundamental objects, we need a deeper ontology. And so I'm not going to try to get an ontology in which consciousness emerges from objects that physicists already tell us are doomed. Space-time is doomed and the objects.
Okay, but I get that. That's kind of I get what you're saying very elegantly, and I think that's consistent. But that okay. But I think that status can still, I could still evolve you a brain, and you go, yeah, that's cool. That's
Sure.
still consistent, and I can make a brain gel. It's cool. What you're saying is we don't know if there is a projection of some relationship between somewhere else and what our brains do. But I mean, you know, again, as a materialist, I know that, you know, the brain is where all it's at for me. And is it related somewhere else beyond space-time? That's an interesting question, but I don't think it's within the realms of current science in terms of provability. So for me, I just have a problem with that kind of notion because I don't gain any deeper insight, even in theory. You know, it's like the thing about gravity waves in the end is like, you know, gravity waves are a great idea. And I remember sitting in a coffee bar with one of my friends going, they'll never detect that. How wrong I was. I mean, it was at the limit, but they detected it. And then suddenly that opened up. And I'm thinking, what you're saying is like, so I'm not, although I don't agree, I'm not scoffing because there might be a framework where this becomes more provable. But I don't see it right now. And until I see it as an empiricist, I'm like, oh yeah, fine. There are loads of other things could exist as well, but I need to develop new concepts that will help me explain novelty and discovery and conscious decision making, stuff like that. So I kind of have sympathy, but I'm like, can I push you more into the, you know, what would you think is going to become provable soon?
Well, so I and some colleagues of mine have I'm interested in getting empirical predictions and tests of this idea as well. So we're proposing this Markovian dynamics beyond space-time. So what inside space-time can you predict? Because that's the only place we can measure are things inside space-time. Mm-hmm. And so we have a proposal that this is Chetan Prakash, who's a mathematical physicist working with me, and also Swapon Chatterjee, who's a particle physicist, does experiments at the Fermilab and at CERN. So, and what we're proposing is to use this Markov dynamics to model. So it's a Markov dynamics outside of space-time, and what we're proposing is to try to match what high energy physicists found in their accelerators, looking at electron-proton collisions, where they put electrons hitting protons at very, very high enough energies that you destroy the proton. And they vary what's called Q squared, which is the energy, and the Bjorken X, which is essentially the temporal resolution. And what they find is that the really high spatial resolutions and high temporal resolutions, you just see inside the proton, you just see a gluon C. It's a mass of gluons. As you back off, lower energy, lower temporal resolution, you see a quark sea. The gluons are breaking into quark, anti-quark pairs and so forth. And then as you back off even further, you see the 3 valence quarks. And so what we're proposing to do is to use this theory of the Markov dynamics of entities beyond space-time to predict exactly the momentum distributions at all Bjork and X and Q squared. So we're trying. So I completely, of course, as a scientist, I have to agree with you that we need to get tests from these. So I'm proposing this hidden Markov model, but I can use the hidden Markov model to make predictions about the states that we can see, namely, for example, the quark sea, the gluon sea, and the valence quarks, and so forth. So if we can start to get precise matching of the momentum distributions that they find at all Bjork and X and Q squared, then it doesn't prove that we're right, but it at least proves that we're in the game, right?
Yeah, so that would be great. So I mean, I would demand that, and then I'd say, right, now disprove your thesis, and then that would be, now disprove your thesis actively, right? And then see what other kind of explanations you have there, because obviously what we're talking about here is, I think you're quite purposefully saying, well, look, let's not just take this aspect of our reality as read. What else could there be? Where are the anomalies, or where do things fall down? And that's great. I'm all for that. But you're, and in a way, I mean, I don't agree. I deeply disagree with you, but not in an angry way. It's just like I don't see what it gives me. But in the same way, people talk about the multiverse, right? And say, and I don't like the multiverse either because I can't see it. So I think so that what you described, that it being predictive, is super interesting. And then that will be great. That will be a landmark, seeing that. And then going beyond that to create other architectures, because if those architectures are better than the architecture you have, or your architecture or the architecture being constructed keeps to survive, this is how new paradigms emerge, because they are just correct. That's the wonderful thing about peeling the layer on the onion that is reality. That there are, each layer has its own special status and qualifications. So that's I'm with you on that.
Right, I think we're on the same page in the sense that my attitude is there's no theory of everything. Science will never get a theory of everything, and the reason is that any scientific theory always starts with assumptions. It has to, and those are not explained by the theory. They're miracles in that sense for the theory. Mm-hmm. And if you say, well, I'll give you a deeper theory that explains those assumptions, that gets rid of those miracles, well, you'll have a new set of assumptions, and there'll be it never ends.
We're an infinite job. I love it.
Infinite job. We have infinite job security here as scientists, which is really quite good. And so my attitude about space-time is just one of those set of premises that we're going to peel away and find out that, of course, space-time has its use. Of course. And just like we don't throw away Newton, of course, Newton is the equations of Newton are wonderful. Just because we have special and general relativity doesn't mean that we get rid of, and quantum theory, we don't get rid of Newton. We treasure Newton, and sometimes we use it for moonshots and so forth. We actually use it, and the same thing will be true of space-time. Space-time, I think, is doomed. It's just the next step in science. We'll get rid of that as a fundamental set of assumptions of space and time, and we'll go deeper. But we will never, of course, space-time is in some sense the only place that we know how to get our measurements, so we will always use it. But science is destined to go deeper with premises beyond space-time, and then show that the dynamics, all the quantum theory and Einstein's general and special relativity, all that stuff that we see in space-time is merely a projection of a much deeper theory that's beyond space-time, and which space-time is just a projection of. And then that's in the sense in which I say it's a user interface.
Well, arguably from that point of view, I guess that's what we're saying about Newtonian mechanics is merely a projection of what's going on when we go deeper into relativity and so on. Yeah, right. I mean, I think one of the things I find that I'm looking for that I don't know the answer to. I mean, I don't know if you want to ask us any other questions or how we keep going for. But one of the things I'm super interested in is understanding the universe tends to, So I don't see the universe as a data structure. I see the universe as kind of analog and kind of doing weird stuff. And I impose my abstraction machinery, which gives me data structure on top and allows me to digitize. I'm not, and that's because the universe is always being predictably unpredictable within certain constraints, which I find fascinating. So what I'm really trying to understand is, you know, how did selection give rise to the cell? Because I don't believe that God built it. You know, I believe that it emerged, and I want to understand. And this is a critical thing. By building assembly theory and the chemistry theories we're doing, I want to kind of say, well, this given stuff in this location, this is the kind of the likelihood of life or the likelihood of processes that undergo selection, which show me interesting things. I want to bound the limits of where I might find evidence of selection in the universe. That's a super important thing to me. I would love to be able to go and say to NASA, please point the JWST at this star, there'll be life there, and look at that, and intelligence happens here. Because if we do that, we're able to frame, you know, the future of humanity, right? You know, are we, you know, as Carl Sagan said, either alone or with friends? Each is terrifying. Which is it? And what experiments can I do in my lab? But the reason I'm mentioning this, and I never thought I would be, not interested, but wanting to think like a cognitive scientist, because the act of the protocell becoming more effective at evolution, it actually almost has to interact with the environment. And whether we call that cognition or not, I think it is. I think it's a very primitive form of cognition driven by evolution, where the concept of a self and the ability to internalize information to help the self persist in time gets booted up over time. And our cognitive capacity didn't just emerge with intelligence, it actually grew with the evolution of biology at a deep level. And I need to understand it because something happens from inanimate matter to living matter in that selection process to give me that ability. And then you start to see these tendencies where the universe shouldn't have, there should be no teleology in the same way there should be no time. You know, teleology and time are just artifacts of things. And I think probably both of those is wrong, but where does the first life form boot up? Where's that transition? Where's that transition in cognition? Where's that transition in teleology? And I never thought that a chemist in a lab beating a test tube is going to use chemicals to answer this question. It'd be great if you have any thoughts on those, or you have any questions that you would like me to answer, you know, have thoughts on. But given that I've got this time with you, I thought I'd ask those questions.
Well, I think that's a great framework. And the way I think about it is that if space-time is just an artifact of projection, and so the appearance of causality, the appearance of an arrow of time is an artifact. Suppose that we have a dynamics of entities. So the dynamics I'm proposing is a dynamics of consciousness. So the entities are actually conscious agents, I call them, beyond space-time. And again, by the way, I'm putting none of this on the physicists. No physicist is endorsing this. I want to make clear that I'm just saying this is my weird idea with my team. And so that ontology takes consciousness and thus life as fundamental. And so from that point of view, the fact that from within our space-time user interface, we have a distinction between what looks to us as living things versus non-living things is merely an artifact of the limitations of our interface. So our interface, what's the point of an interface? So the idea is that space-time is an interface that some conscious agents use to interact with other conscious agents. It's just one of countless interfaces. I'm not thinking space-time is in any way special. It's probably one of the more prosaic interfaces. I suspect that we got a cheap model, but there are far more interesting interfaces than space-time, and we are some of the unlucky ones that are stuck with the cheap model. But this cheap model, as a result of its own limitations, there's this appearance of a distinction between living and non-living, and there's an appearance of an arrow of time in which the non-living things appear to have evolved into living things. But that arrow, as I mentioned earlier, is a theorem of this Markov process stuff, that you can have a Markov chain in which there is no arrow of time, but it appears from the projection that there is entropic time. So you know, I've done a lot of work on evolution of natural selection. I actually don't think evolution of natural selection is fundamental. Obviously, I can't, because I don't think time is fundamental. Now, in evolutionary theory, time is the fundamental limited resource. Evolution is about organisms competing for limited resources. Time is the fundamental limited resource. What I'm saying is, within a space-time framework, evolution by natural selection is a beautiful theory within that framework. As soon as you step outside, the very notion of time as a limited resource disappears, and the notion of all limited resources that, of course, evolution depends. You need a competition for limited resources to have the engine of evolution. And I'm saying that all of that, so evolution by natural selection is the beautiful theory that you get as an entirely artifactual result of the projection of a deeper theory in which there is no distinction between living and non-living, and there are no limited resources, and there is no arrow of time.
So, I mean, that for me is kind of fantastical, nonsensical. I would say, for me, that lacks clarity, because it doesn't help me. It doesn't help me frame anything, the scaffolding there. I mean, you know, I'm wanting to understand what you mean, but I'm completely bamboozled by that, just simply because, you know, as an interrogator of my reality and building things up, sure, you can tell me there's something deeper, and I'm sure you're right, there is. And sure, you can then say, well, there's these conscious agents in this beyond space-time. Okay, but then we have to label what consciousness is, right? And then I think then if the words lack meaning, like it's just everything, then maybe it's nothing. And what I mean by that is, like, are you literally saying that there are, you know, for me, consciousness is defined by, let me try and get this right so you can so you can know where I'm coming from, is like a lump of stuff that has been produced on a causal chain in biology that is able to remember the past, imagine the future, and experience the present. And that merely helps me navigate my spatial dimensions, space and time. Now, if you're saying, oh, right, well, you've got these conscious agents beyond space-time, then that kind of you see projected, and there's no difference between living and non-living. But that doesn't operationally help me, because there is dead sand, right? I can take the sand and shred it, and I don't go to jail. If I did it to some life forms, I'd go to jail. And so I guess what I'd like to kind of understand, and maybe, is like, what do you mean by a conscious agent beyond space-time? Are you talking about God? Are you talking about lots of different agents which are conscious, you know, Bob, Jim, Tracy, I don't know, Cecilia, whatever, you know, whether they're gendered or not, doesn't actually matter. Well, what do you mean by conscious agents? Because for me, I wonder if is it not, you're just saying you've got these things that can do mathematics in real time, and the outcome of that is something. Well, what I guess I don't understand what you mean by conscious agent beyond space-time. I mean, all three things I struggle with, but all three together, I'm in a new universe.
Fair enough. So conscious agent is a technical term for us. So it's mathematically defined. It has three sets: a set of experiences, a set of actions, and a set of other conscious agents that it's interacting with, and including itself. And then there's mappings. So those sets are probability spaces. So each set is a probability space. So, for example, you might have a simple conscious agent that has only one experience. It experiences red. That's it. It has the experience of red, and that's all. It's a very, very simple conscious agent. Then you could have one that sees red and green. And so you can build up. It turns out, with our definition, when you have two agents, they also satisfy the definition of agent. So there is a combined agent as well.
Why call it conscious? Could you not call it another word? Because what you're talking about is actually quite interesting, right? Experience, maybe that means memory. Actions, that means some kind of kinetics. And then the set for all other action. I mean, is there not less, I mean, not triggering, but less kind of emotive words you can use that will help people understand the theory? Because by adding these words in, you're
Sure.
giving a mysticism to something you're not intending to give a mysticism to, as far as I can see.
Well, absolutely. So we could take our same formalism and just say these are just dynamical entities beyond space-time, period. They have a set of states, they have a set of actions, and there's a network of them. And so it's all probability spaces, and the interactions are written by Markovian kernels. And it's absolutely, and in fact, if we ever publish a paper in a physics journal on this, of course, we're going to use just dynamical entities beyond space-time. We're not going to talk about consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. I would suggest you throw away the conscious agent, because then you're throwing everything in the air, right? And then what I think are saying is, okay, great. You're then saying, to what degree is matter that we see projected in our universe, in the user interface, as you describe it, causally connected to these other objects, and where does the action happen? Is the action happening in the conscious of these? Sorry, you got me doing it now. With these agents, these causal agents beyond space time, or something in space time? It could be the other way around as well, right? We could be doing, who is the prime causer? But okay, that clarifies things for me. I still deeply not disagree. I just don't see the need for it, because it doesn't give me any extra explanation yet. But I can understand, and my training as a scientist and wishing to be open-minded can say, hey, go on, Don, just show me the use at some point, or help me suspend my disbelief for long enough, and then something's going to turn up, right? Or right. Like the process of science, like all good ideas, what's the difference between a good idea and a bad idea? As long as if they're done in good faith, the good ideas find use. The bad ideas, or the good ideas that aren't as good, just aren't used. There was just another go. We try again, right? It's I guess how I learned my kind of structures of scientific revolutions. It's your job to go out and propose something weird with
sure.
no friends. And then maybe you get some friends, and then maybe suddenly everyone realizes you're right, and then the entire thing shifts over, and you're no longer weird. You are the new paradigm. But right now, I must say, you're a bit weird. But I've got respect for that.
Well, I completely agree. It's completely out there. The reason why I think about consciousness when I think about these other things beyond space-time is that I'm interested in the hard problem of consciousness, right? With the hard problem of consciousness, as is traditionally put, is how can we get something like brains to give rise to consciousness? What are the neural correlates of consciousness? And we're having a lot of success there. There's a lot of work that's quite successful in neural correlates of consciousness. But when it then comes to taking the next step and saying, okay, here's how this particular neural correlate of consciousness actually creates the experience of the taste of mint, for example, we're drawing complete blanks. So much so that Steven Pinker, for example, in his book Enlightenment Now, when he was talking about the hard problem, he likes a particular model called the global workspace model of consciousness. So there's a notion of that in computer science, you can have global workspaces where certain items are sort of like in a short-term memory that's more accessible to more states of the system. And those might correspond to the things that we would call conscious. And Pinker, says in that book that he sort of likes the global workspace model, but he says the last dollop in the theory, and he uses the word dollop, is that we have to stipulate the connection between the neural dynamics on the one hand that implements the system versus the actual experience. We have to stipulate the conscious experience. So the correlation between the two has to be stipulated. And I think Pinker is absolutely right. I think that's an honest assessment where the field is. There's not a single principled prediction from for example, global workspace or integrated information theory or orchestrated collapse of quantum microtubule states and so forth to a specific conscious experience. And I think Pinker is right. We have to stipulate it, and it's for principled reasons. So given that, we either are going to end up being dualists. So we have to stipulate the conscious experiences, and we're stipulating space-time. So we can be dualists because we're stipulating both. Or we can be illusionists. So like Keith Frankish and Dan Dennett, both brilliant gentlemen, and I like them both. But they say that consciousness is an illusion. Now, most people don't want to go there. They don't want to say that my feeling of love, my feeling of, the taste of chocolate are all illusions, that it's entirely an illusion. I'm So they succeed in being physicalist monists at the price of cutting us off from what we think is perhaps the dearest thing to us, which is our conscious experiences. So I'm going after this conscious agent thing. I'll shut up after this, for simply the reason I want to be a monist. I don't want to be a dualist, and I don't want to get rid of conscious experiences. And I think I can boot up space-time and all of physics as a projection of this dynamics of conscious agents. So I would succeed then in being a monist where consciousness is the only thing that's stipulated. Instead of stipulating consciousness and space-time, I stipulate only consciousness and derive space-time. And that way I beat the current physicalist models, which have to stipulate both.
So okay, I understand that. I think I'm in the illusionist camp, but I'm not just an illusionist. I'll tell you why. And I think actually it's not as lonely as you think. Because I mean, I kind of like my local union. So the thing is, all three of us in this discussion just now, we all share a common pathway going back to Luca. So the last universal common ancestor, or let's suggest that. And so we're all going through features of evolution and the emergence of human species. And so the taste of mint is totally arbitrary, but it's our arbitrary taste. And because we all share that relationship, because of the fact that I know you're feeling that when you taste the mint, and you know I'm feeling that, even though it's illusions, results, sensory input, and the evolutionary framework, we are actually able to empathize, and that actually creates an entirely higher emotional, intellectual level that we make real in our current reality without having to go beyond it in some way. So although the illusionists are kind of sad and kind of, told you, know it all, I think there's something else that emerges beyond that. It isn't magical. The emergence isn't magical. It's entirely programmed as a feature from those atomic to those molecular to those biochemical interactions. And I think you probably don't need that to be a monist in that degree. You can just you can just become an assembly theorist, kind of, if you like. I don't know. It's another way of doing it, and you get that. But what I'm still wrapping my head around is this kind of HQ for the universe. I kind of think when you're saying, beyond space-time, well, what is it? Is there another substance that has dimensionality, that has coordinates? Is there another time axes in which this stuff operates? So you can say, I think so. There's a lot of I think you'll benefit from, if these become mainstream and you get them to become explanatory, you can falsify them, you can come up with additional counter theories that aren't as good as yours, or the ones that develop. There will need to be a new nomenclature, or a new ontology, as you correctly put it. I'm even learning that word at the moment as well. And that's going to be important, because then that's going to allow people to derive new meaning in these theories. In the same way, in assembly theory, I'm having to build this new ontology for causation and selection, and how time has to be fundamental in this ontology for it to mean anything. A lot of people are arguing, saying you don't need time to be fundamental, but I think it will actually become provable from this framework. And I just want to see if I can disprove it. And then if I disprove it long enough and it stands up and we get new predictions, then I think that's something else that we can do there. But it may be worth thinking, because we all share that common history. We are illusionists, but there's something else, right? Because I can know, before you say, Lee, I'm going to eat some mint, I know what you're about to experience. So that's not illusionary, because that's just shared experience. But we don't need to go back to necessarily a kind of beyond space-time to have that experience, I would argue. But I'm open.
Well, first, of course, I agree with you that having experiments for all of our theories is absolutely essential. And so I completely agree. And until we have experimental tests, that's fine. But I do want to raise an issue for the illusionists now, right? I've raised an issue for the panpsychists, and also those who claim that they can boot up consciousness from physics or from neurobiology. The problem with the physicalist approaches of consciousness is they can't explain a single specific conscious experience. You might think, okay, well, the illusionists don't have that problem, but they've got almost exactly the same problem. They need to explain why this pattern of brain activity leads to the illusion of the experience of mint and not the illusion of the taste of chocolate. They still owe us a precise scientific theory that says, for principled reasons, this pattern of neural activity must be the illusion of mint. It could not be the illusion of chocolate. And once again, I propose that that is not possible to do for principled reasons.
I think it is from
Okay.
principle in the fact that your brain is like a layer, like your brain is a 5-dimensional organ. It's been evolved over time. It exists in time. And also it's been evolved generation to generation in the morphology. And again, you know, so the taste of chocolate isn't just random. It's the way our brain is integrated. And the chocolate, if you think about the molecules that go into your taste buds, and that's the only bona fide quantum biology I know of, right? In terms of where you get hydrogen bonding between the molecules in your taste buds and your nose. And that series of receptors associated with the texture with that object allows you to construct this very precise lock and key.
Sure.
You know, you can say that you have this data structure in your head, if you like, and the coordinates come from the taste, from the smell, and so on, and the texture, and that's and they're fairly predictable, and that's why you get chocolate. When everyone tastes chocolate, they taste the same thing, and they're being produced by this evolutionary process. You've got a number of things going for you there. Now, I would like to know what a fish. I don't know if fish can taste. I guess they do. But what does chocolate taste like to a fish? Not to a human, but to two salmons. You know, two different, but same species. I'd love to know between different species how, you know, these perceptions change. But I think I don't know enough about neurobiology and the cognitive neuroscience to understand these neurocorrelates and where people are stuck. But I think that integrated information theory, you're right, is kind of flawed for that for various reasons, but a good attempt. I think that we need to think about it more in these chains of events, and also ask ourselves, you know, what does it actually mean to be, you know, not just conscious, but intelligent and autonomous? Because the other thing that biology gives us, embodiment gives us, which why I like the physical universe, is we're embodied entities. We can move around the environment. We're somewhat autonomous. We can find water and food, even if the internet goes down and all the super AGI is kind of, you know, take all the resources. They're not going to take away the rest of the planet. You know, we can still do stuff. So we have this little embodied autonomous intelligence that wanders around the biosphere. And that's happened, right, over the course of, you know, 4.2 billion years. And so our sensors interacting with the environment have programmed a morphology in our brain that we unfold all the time. And one of the things I'd like to know, I mean, I think, you know, you disagree with this, I think, because you think it's the other way around. But I would like you to consider for a day that evolution, just for a day, because it might come up with some new ideas as well. Consider for a day that actually evolution has hidden. There's lots of reality hidden in our biology that we haven't yet seen. Part of our problem is is understanding that, and what is it about the different sensory inputs that help us understand the reality in which we're involved. You know, my theory is that the origin of life tells us that, well, life on Earth today tells us about the available chemistry at the origin of life, number one, and then how life has evolved since then, number two, and happenstance and contingent asteroids hitting the Earth and all that stuff. So I think there's, you know, I think evolution has a lot to offer us here. But you know, I'm open-minded to kind of keep trying to understand, at least from this conversation. I think you've understood a little bit more where I'm coming from. I've stripped away some of the nomenclature, and you've told me about the mathematical frameworks. I have a great deal of understanding. Well, not a great deal of understanding. Some new understanding I had before, particularly about the loss of information and the emergence of entropy as a kind of like just the way people mislabeled things. I find that super interesting, and I'll be thinking about that.
Yeah, thank you. And I've been equally. It's been a lot of pleasure to talk with you and hear your ideas really laid out. I really appreciate that. I'd love to do this again sometime. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Give us a little time to think about this, and maybe come back and have a round two.
Yes, definitely. I think you guys, both of you, discussed topics and questions that I had in mind. So I literally had nothing to say. The conversation flow was amazing, but we could definitely do a round two where we can, like, go deeper into topics that were discussed, and then we go from there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, I think just release it, see what people say, and then we'll kind of just feedback. I think this is not just a conversation between us. It's like trying to figure out what is the universe about? What this is the competition of ideas, and ideas can sound good, and then they can become good, and like you're only as good as your falsification sometimes. But then if you falsify too quick, then you can never come up with anything deeply interesting. So it's this battle between convergent and divergent thinking. And what I wanted to do today, with talk to Don, is to say, are you being a trickster with these words, or are you giving shortcuts? And it's definitely the latter and not the former. So that's cool. I don't agree with it all, but at least I understand the points of disagreement and also my framing of them, and I hope the same is likewise.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I've gotten a lot better understanding of yours as well. And by the way, if you're out in Irvine, you'd be welcome to come visit us at my lab as well. I'd love to have you.
I'm sure we're going to go hang out sometime. I'm sure that will be fun to do. Okay, it was great to do this. It's getting on for 11:15 my time, and I still have to run 4 miles before I sleep.
Oh boy. Wow, impressive.
But really nice to meet you. Thanks for organizing this again, and it's been great. Is there anything else we should say before we go?
Do you guys just want to have like a conclusive statement? I think we kind of covered it, but like something that you want to say to each other that I can put at the end. That's it.
I'm good. I think I would just say I really enjoyed this, and a lot to think about. And once we've thought about it, let's do it again.
Perfect. Sounds good.
Yeah, I'm the same. I think it's very good to kind of take some space to listen to people's ideas, even if you don't agree with them, and also challenge yourself to adopt the ideas for a day. Because what do you lose? You might learn something new, right?
That's right.
But just having this conversation, there's so many new things I learned today that I'm going to have to go and think about. So it's kind of like my brain's exploding.
And thank you, Neha, for arranging this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Neha. Yeah,